with of the clay in Daniel chapter 2, and I laid out these 4 columns that look at Daniel 2, 7, 8 and 11, listed the various characteristics in each of these visions, and just in summary, what I said was this. In Daniel 2, 7, 8 and 11, that you had this distinction between Satan's kingdom and God's kingdom. And in Daniel chapter 8, focusing on verse 12, I'm saying this verse 12 is lining up with verse 41 to 43 in chapter 2. And in chapter 8, it talks about a church that's in transgression, that's in a relationship with the state. The specific history was the papacy with Clovis. And when we take this imagery, and even if we go into Daniel chapter 7, we looked at Daniel chapter 7, we looked at verse 8, and I've got a little graphic here of Daniel 7 verse 8. We see the same dynamic. We see this iron beast that has 10 horns in its head, and after these 10 spring up, then you see another little horn that comes up, and at its behest 3 of those horns get plucked up. You see a church-state relationship here going on. So we see a church-state relationship, church-state relationship, and if we're going to apply this consistently through this passage, we see the same thing. If we were to go to Daniel chapter 11, again you'd see the same issue being brought to view there. If we were going to think about this church-state relationship, because if we were to run right down from verse 36 in Daniel 11, I'll put verse 36 down here, and we went right down, we could stop at 40 and even maybe go into verse 41, but you can see that there's a relationship between the activities that this church is doing and that it needs state support to make war. The clearest one to see that we're all familiar with is Daniel 11 verse 40. So in verse 40, you know, the king of the north, the papacy, is going to make war with the king of the south, the USSR, and it's going to use military and economic strength to do that, which is the army that it's called to its aid, which is the United States, beginning around 1984 and carrying on into present day. So you have 3 chapters that deal with this church-state relationship. Some of this we understand the history because it's contemporary. You can see in the imagery in both of these chapters. But when we get to Daniel chapter 2, and in Daniel chapter 2 we see the same church-state relationship. We see that this clay is mixing with the iron in the feet, and when I mean feet going into the toes. There's this discussion that goes on that perhaps there's something good about this clay, because people pick up the word potter's clay and they do proof text, they do line upon line, and they come to an understanding that potter's clay represents something that's good because it's representation of God's people, and then it turns to miry clay, that it goes from good to bad. And I'm suggesting that you've got 3 testimonies, 1, 2, 3, because they're all the same vision, that upon the testimony of 3 a thing is established, that when you come to Daniel chapter 2, that you're forced by this logic to not come to the conclusion that this must be a good clay. It has to be a clay that's bad. And you don't need those visions to do that. You can do it straight out of Daniel 2, because I think one of the points that my brother was bringing is that how comes we're working backwards and not forwards? And I agree that we should be working forward, but many people stumble over Daniel 2. And if you're going to stumble over Daniel 2, I think it's one of William Miller's rules of prophetic interpretation. If there's a passage that's too hard to understand, you go to another passage that you do understand. And everybody understands verse 12. And everybody understands verse 40. So upon the testimony of two, this should be established. But most of us understand verse 8 as well. They understand the relationship between this church and these states. So we have three testimonies that bear upon this passage here. So we should be able to see by drawing out this table that this is a representation of something that is not good. Because in its very imagery, it's mixing with iron. And during the break, I was having a discussion with my brother, and he had a point. And so, what was the explanation that you were saying about this?
Oh, that the clay being God's church, because they're saying they are God's church and they're representing God's church. The papacy being. They claim, yes.
Yeah.
They claim to be God's church on earth, and they go around doing all these things, but because they are mixing with the iron and they're working with the state, then they're in transgression.
Yes.
That's right in line with the 10 virgins that all professed. You know, when Yellow White explains the 10 virgins, she says they all profess purity. Yeah.
So this is what takes you back right to chapter 8, verse 12, that this church can only be in transgression because it defines itself as a church, as a representation of Christ on earth, hence representing a representation of its bride, of his bride. And so this is what is causing this transgression. So when the transgression is adultery, it's committing adultery, these churches, it's committing fornication with the kings of the earth. So we could go into Revelation 17 and we could see that clearly.
Transgression can fit anyone, yeah?
We could say it could fit anybody, but we have to let Scripture define how that word is being used. And the way it's being used in the book of Daniel is in a very specific way. It's when this church enters into a relationship with the state, it comes into transgression. It says it very specifically. You can see that in chapter 12. But if you go to Revelation 17 and let that bear upon this discussion, then you know you've got a woman and you've got a beast, which is a church-state relationship, and it says that she enters into a relationship of fornication with the kings of the earth. In fact, she's called the mother of harlots, and the definition of a harlot is a prostitute, and she's the mother of all those prostitutes. Those prostitutes are churches, her daughters. So you see this imagery over and over again of this transgression not being a generic term of transgression, that anybody can be in transgression, but it's talking about a specific scenario set up that this transgression is dealing with. And
specific sins or
yes.
Specific issues, yeah. Okay.
And the specific issue is that there's a church that claims to represent Christ, but yet is entering into a relationship with the world to do its biddings. And in the imagery of Daniel chapter 2, it says that they're mixing together. So the imagery is of these two things mixing, but it says in the passage that they can mix, and in fact they do mix, but they can't cleave.
All right. That bottom part of that image, the iron and the clay, God is giving us a snapshot of the world at that particular dispensation of time, yes?
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah, it's okay to say that the clay, and God does define Israel as clay and his people, but not necessarily, I'm not so much trying to say that the clay is, all the clay represented between those toes and the feet and so forth are all good people. It represents the world.
Ellen White,
Right?
in Spirit of Prophecy, comes right out and says that the mingling of the clay and the iron is the clay and iron represent the mingling of churchcraft and statecraft. She comes right out and says that in Spirit of Prophecy.
Oh, 1 second.
Can I just make a suggestion that we have time afterwards?
Okay, yeah.
I would like to allow him to present the points and maybe hold the questions. I'm just because I know you have, I know because I've heard this presentation on the clay, and we're going to miss a blessing if we don't allow him to finish his presentation on that and hold the questions and discussions on it till afterwards, because we'll have time afterwards. If we can
So
get
yeah,
rid of
that's
that.
probably a good idea. So I'll go through the study and see if it makes any sense, and if it doesn't, maybe some of the questions will be answered, maybe they won't.
Oh, if it does, we'll bring you back. Okay.
Yeah. So what I've tried to do so far is to look at this issue of iron and clay from the perspective of structure. I've looked at the structure of Daniel 2, 7, 8 and 11, and structurally my first argument is that you can show and defend that this clay is not representing something that's good, it's actually representing something that's bad all the way through. And in fact, this potter's clay and miry clay is representing the transgression of desolation. It's the church and the state that are in a relationship one with another. And the wording says that they're able to mix together, but they're not able to cleave one with another. So first of all, we looked at the structure of the passages itself, the visions themselves and how they interlock one with another. So that's one argument that we have. So the other argument is, I think we read a passage earlier from the Spirit of Prophecy. It says, when Christ was talking about the parables from Christ Object Lessons, it says he explains spiritual things through nature, through the natural things that we see and that we can sense and that we can understand. So when we go to this vision and we see that these things can mix but they can't cleave, the second argument that I'd like to bring is that if you were to do a science experiment and you were to bring these elements together and try to reproduce what's being brought to view in this vision, I think you'd get something like this. You'd get if we had a container just like this, but we turned the container into the shape of a foot, and then we put a mixer into this. What I'm suggesting is this, that if you took two elements and you brought iron into this and you bring clay, would those two elements be able to mix one with another?
Heterogeneously or homogeneously?
The clay would become miry because it would absorb part of the elements of the iron, but they won't mix.
So
it'll become miry. The clay has to.
So I'm really thinking this at a really simple level. So if I had a container here of clay, we'll put iron. Most of us at grade school have done sort of experiments with iron filings. Yeah? Iron filings are these little elements of iron that you put on a piece of paper and you put the magnet underneath them and you can get all these shapes. So if we had a container full of iron filings and we had a container here full of dry powder, and you put them together and you mix them up, they would mix perfectly well.
Iron oxidizes very well.
Okay? So I don't mean about oxidation, you just mix them, you've got two dry powders mixing together.
It's a heterogeneous mixture. They're there, but they're not.
Yeah.
They haven't chemically bonded with
That's
each
right.
other.
So, sorry sis, you wanted to ask a question? Or make a statement?
Well, clay, because clay is something that is damp. And
Sometimes.
well, dirt is dry. Clay is really considered, when you find it in nature, it's damp.
And the pottery is.
But when it's stirred up, and it's constantly stirred up by a common enemy, they will mix. But when the enemy that's stirring stops, they do separate. That's why they can't cleave to each other.
Okay, so I'm going to try and show through a word study that this clay actually isn't wet clay, it's actually dry clay. But I'm just showing you what the imagery, at a really simple level, without any complications. If you had two dry powders, you'd know that they'd be able to mix. And if they're dry, they wouldn't stick one to another.
But in nature, you have all the metals in clay. You can have all the copper, you can have iron, you can have all those metals in clay, just soil, dirt. You can have all those metals there.
Mhm.
Yes.
Now, if this clay was wet, then when you try to mix these things together, you would know straight away that they would cleave one to another. They would stick. Because anything that's wet, you try digging something up, some wet soil, it will stick to your spade, to your shovel. So you know, just from the imagery that's being brought to view, without anything else, that they must be two dry powders or two dry elements. Neither of them can be wet or sticky, otherwise they'd cleave together. So that's the other argument that I want to present, is first of all through the structure, that it must be representing a church that's in transgression, because it's in a relationship with the state. It's an adulterous relationship. The second imagery that you see in these verses is that it says very clearly that they mix together, but they don't stick, they won't glue, they won't become one. And that imagery of cleaving, I'm suggesting, is brought to view from Genesis, when Adam and Eve, two separate beings, marry and come together and become one flesh, which is the definition of marriage. The definition of marriage is when two people become one flesh, a legitimate marriage. Now, if you're in a adulterous relationship with anybody, you can't become one flesh, because by definition it's a relationship that's in fornication. So to cleave, it can only be a legitimate relationship, a legitimate marriage. So both physically you can see that this cannot be talking about some clay that's wet and sticky, because it's not cleaving. Spiritually or symbolically, you can see that this group, this church and this state, can't become one flesh. And the reason they can't become one flesh is because this church is already married to someone else. It's married to Christ, just by profession. I'm not saying anything more about the Catholic Church. Even just by profession, it's the bride of Christ. So all of that imagery is teaching you the same point that I brought to view when you see the structure. So I'm saying that there's two testimonies that we already have to show you that whatever condition this church is in, it's not in a wet, malleable condition. Now, when most people think of potter's clay and you do a word study on it, the imagery that they're going to bring to forth is a potter's table with a lump of clay on there that the potter's going to start working on and fashioning and doing something with. And when you start picking up this imagery from this phrase here, then this is going to be wet, sticky clay. And if it was wet, sticky clay, then this whole imagery that's defined in the chapter wouldn't be correct. They would cleave one to another. So what I'm saying is that this whole viewpoint that potter's clay is talking about a dynamic that's brought to view here, where this clay is on a potter's wheel being shaped by a potter, isn't the correct way of understanding what's being brought to view here. So I want to offer an alternative position, which I think is both correct and defendable. So the first argument I want to bring to view is that we've run through all of these verses. We've got verse 33, verse 34, 35, then 41, 42, 43 and 45. So these are all the verses. It doesn't actually mention clay in verse 44, but I put them together. So when you look at all of these verses and you do a word study on clay, which we're going to do in a moment, I don't know if people are familiar that obviously the Old Testament was written in Hebrew. We all realise that. But there was an Old Testament that was written in Greek. It's called the Septuagint, and it was written sometime after Alexander the Great started interacting with God's people, and it was commissioned by the Greeks so that the Bible would be accessible to the rest of the world, so they would be able to understand it. They got 50 Hebrew scholars together to write out the Old Testament scriptures in Greek. Some people have great issue about the Septuagint because they say it's erroneous and full of error. And I'm not trying to get into that discussion. I'm not trying to talk about the rights and wrongs of the Septuagint, whether you like it or whether you don't. But it is a reality. It's a real Bible, and many people use it. And I'm not using this next piece of argument as a defense, but you can show if you're an expert on ancient languages, and I'm not, that when many of the disciples and even Christ was quoting the Old Testament in their words, in their dialogue that we have, many times they're quoting the Old Testament, they actually quote from the Septuagint, from the Greek Old Testament. They're not quoting from the Masoretic text or the Hebrew Old Testament. So I'm not using that as defense. All I'm just saying is people have used the Greek Old Testament for thousands of years. Even Christ used it. And that's just a fact of history. The reason why I bring that point up is, as you run through these verses, so verse 33 says clay, verse 34 says clay, verse 35 says clay, then verse 41 says potter's clay, and then miry clay. It's found in found in verse 41. Then verse 42 says clay, verse 43 says miry clay, and then it says clay again, and then verse 45 says clay. So you get clay that's running through all of these verses, and in verse 41 and 43 it says potter's clay and miry clay. Now if you see the equivalent verses in the Septuagint, which is the Greek Old Testament, the way that's written out is quite different. So verse 33 reads something like this: his feet, part of iron and part of earthenware. So I'm going to write it down. It says earthenware, and then verse 34 it says earthenware. Verse 35 it calls it a potsherd or potsherd. I'll talk about what that is in a moment. Most of us already know. Verse 41, when it says potter's clay, it uses the same word, earthenware, and this is for potter's clay. When it says miry clay, it then switches to potsherd. And then into verse 42, it says earthenware. I just put P for potsherd, then potsherd, and then lastly potsherd. So this is miry clay, and this is potter's clay. So what I'm trying to show you here is that, so this is the third argument, that when Hebrew scholars looked at these passages in the Hebrew, and when they interpreted what this clay and this potter's clay, miry clay, and just the word clay meant, they understood it to mean earthenware or a potsherd. Now a potsherd can be defined two ways. A potsherd is literally a pot. So that's earthenware, whether it's in the form of a plate. Maybe I should do a better drawing. I did that before once and people didn't know what on earth I was drawing. So I'll draw a cup like here. So this is earthenware, a cup, and a potsherd can be this as well, but also a potsherd can actually just be a fragment or a shard. So we're familiar with what a shard is. A shard is a fragment of a material that's broken. So a potsherd can be either one of those two things. So when these Hebrew scholars looked at these words, they understood them to mean to have this imagery here. So as soon as you begin to see that this is how they this is how they understood what's being brought to view here, you know straight away that this view is in agreement with the idea that they're two dry elements, that it's not wet sticky clay, but it must be something that's dried. It must be something that's already been fired and that's been used or created by a potter. So one of the things I want us to see is that when it uses the word potter's clay, I'm saying this, that if you think of a potter's wheel and there's a lump of clay on here, this is not what the potter's clay is representing. It represents something that moves on down the production line, and it's actually a vessel that's been created by the potter. It's a piece of clay that's already been formed. And when we talk about potter's clay in the scriptures, and if we have time we'll read through some of those verses, when it says, "Thou art the potter, we are the clay," that clay that God is going to use is actually fit. It's not fit for purpose. It's not even doing anything. It's just this lump that's been carved out of the ground, worthless. And then when he shapes and fashions this clay into a vessel, it then becomes fit for use. So I'm suggesting this is the definition of, I'll put the symbol of church, could call it a Christian, and this is a symbol of someone that's coming out or being carved out of the world. So he carves us out of the world as a lump of clay, then he fashions and shapes us into something that's of use, which is a vessel. Paul talks about this in a number of places, where he says we're vessels that are used by the Lord. And there are different types of vessels. There's vessels for holy use, and there's vessels for, cooking or sanitary use, and some are used for filthy things. So this argument is saying this, that Hebrew scholars understood that the imagery that's brought to view here is something that's already fired. It's not something that's wet and malleable clay. It's this type of a clay. So if we can see that this is how Hebrew scholars understood it, and you want to try and mix iron and clay together, I'm suggesting that it can't be clay that's looking like this, that's all these lots of pieces of vessels or plates or dishes that's mixing with iron. It must be these small shards of pottery that are mixing, because you've got two elements mixing together, and they're going to take the form of a foot and toes. And we'll see that as we go through a word study, that you can see that this is the case, that it's not a vessel that looks like this. It's a vessel that originally looked like this, has been smashed to pieces, and is in broken fragments, and these are the fragments that are mixing with the iron in that state that I was speaking of. So you have a potter's clay, which is turned into a vessel, and then this vessel gets smashed up into broken pieces of clay, and these are the things here that are mixing with iron. You can see that when from just a surface understanding of how Hebrew scholars viewed what that clay is representing. So that's three arguments that we've brought to view. And I think it's defendable to use the Septuagint in this example. Now, we could go through many Bible verses about all the different types of clay that there are. And what I want to do is look at some words that are to do with clay in the Bible. So I'm looking at the word clay, and let's turn to Job chapter 4. Let's turn to Job chapter 4. So what I'm going to do is we're doing a study on clay, and this word for clay is the Hebrew word 2563. And this word 2563 comes from another word, which is 2560. And I'm going to give the definition that's found in Strong's and another lexicon. It just means either cement or mortar or clay, but it also has this implication of something that's bubbling up, mire or a heap, or something that's you daub or you use to seal or to smear. So let's read Job chapter 4 verse 19. How much less in them that dwell in houses of clay, whose foundation is the dust, which are crushed before the moth. So it's a bit of an obscure passage, but all I'm picking up from this verse here is that them that dwell in houses of clay. So what I understand this to mean is that we're formed from the dust of the earth, and we're formed into vessels, and the vessels that we're formed into are houses of clay, that we are made from clay. So when it talks about them that dwell in houses of clay, I don't think it's talking about people's homes. It's talking about our bodies. Our bodies are vessels, and we're literally made of clay. So this clay that's being spoken of is, you know, this kind of vessel here. It's the vessel that God has created. Job chapter 10 verse 9. Job chapter 10 verse 9 says, "Remember, I beseech thee, that thou hast made me as the clay, and wilt thou bring me into dust again?" So all that is saying is that we were created from dust, then we were formed into this body, and the dust and the clay are the same thing, and then when we die, we're going to return to dust again. So it's just bringing this whole idea that we're this vessel, and it's not talking about this imagery here when we talk about that. We'll skip out of Job and maybe look at another one. Let's go to Isaiah 29:16. Isaiah 29:16. "Surely your turning of things upside down shall be esteemed as potter's clay. For shall the work say of him that made it, he made me not? Or shall the thing framed say of him that framed it, he had no understanding?" So this passage is talking about, it mentions potter's clay right in there, and it says that your turning things upside down shall be esteemed as potter's clay. So what that is, I think what this verse is saying is this: the Lord has this potter's clay, and he turned it into something, and now this vessel is talking to its maker, and he's saying, "Why did you make me like this?" And the response back is, hold on, who's the one who did the creating? How can the thing that was created tell the creator what he did was right or wrong? So that's all that passage is saying. But when it uses the term potter's clay, it's talking about a clay that's been made by something, and it's talking about the relationship between this vessel and the potter. And the vessel's complaining to the potter saying, "I don't like the way I look." And the response is, "Who are you to complain? The potter can make you any way he wants to." So one of the proof verses for this potter's clay is actually talking about clay that's in that condition. It's not talking about clay in that condition. 45 verse 9. "Woe unto him that striveth with his maker. Let the potsherd strive with the potsherds of the earth. Shall the clay say to him that fashioneth it, What makest thou? Or thy work, he hath no hands." So all this passage is saying is the same thing. There's these potsherds, these vessels, and they're complaining to their maker saying, "Why did you make me the way you've made me?" And he says, if you want to have a discussion with somebody, let the vessels have a discussion with other vessels. So you and me can complain to each other about, you know, the condition that we're in, but we have no right to go to God and complain to him.
The clay in 29:16 is a different clay than the others that you've referenced, but I think it still kind of follows the same if you take the bubbling up. But it's a different, Strong's is a different rendering and a different word is used for it.
29:16 is, I've got 25:63. 25:63, is that what you've got?
No, 33:35. 33:35.
Let me have a check.
2563, the clay is
There's
2563.
Yeah,
another one.
Yeah, the clay is 25:63.
okay. So the other one that I think you're picking up is what it says is the phrase potter.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's the same word, clay. I want to be careful because I can make mistakes. So thank you for just double checking that. I think it's the same clay all the way through. Then did someone else say something?
Yeah, there's another one that's 2783, which is directly referencing the potsherd.
In which verse?
16 appearances in the Bible.
Okay, I think we're gonna come to some of them. So I'm just picking up this
I
one.
noticed we just went to one. We just,
45:9?
yeah. Isaiah 45:9. It mentions
Oh,
twice.
the potsherd, yeah.
Yeah.
Let's go to 64 verse 8. This is one of the classic verses that people use when they're having this discussion about who the clay is, whether it's good people or bad people. 64 verse 8 says, "But now, O Lord, thou art our Father, we are the clay, and thou art potter, and we are the work of thy hand." So I'm saying in the proof text that most people are going to use to say that this potter's clay is representing God's people, I'm saying all this verse really teaches is that this person, and I'm not arguing that it's not God's church, is the work of God's hand. So a potter's clay is still representing something that's in this stage, not this stage, because it says we are the work of thy hand. We're the finished product of what you've created us to be. So 64 verse 8 is still teaching us that this is a representation. And is it the church? Yes. And the context of this is in Isaiah 64 verse 8. It's obviously talking about ancient Israel, God's people. But the point I want to make is that it's this phase and not this phase. Everywhere that you find, you always see God's church in this state, not in that state. We could go to Jeremiah 18 verse 4. Jeremiah 18 verse 4. "And the vessel that he made of clay was marred in the hand of the potter. So he made it again another vessel, as seemed good to the potter to make it." So here you can clearly see that the potter's going to make a vessel out of clay, and if the vessel wasn't the way he liked it, he'll just remake it into another vessel that he likes. Drop down to verse 6. It says, "O house of Israel, cannot I do with you as this potter, saith the Lord? Behold, as the clay is in the potter's hand, so are ye in mine hand, O house of Israel." So the Lord is going to make this clay into a vessel that he sees fit. So I want to look at another word that's dealing with clay. And so we've looked at verses that deal with clay here, and now this is H2916. In H2916, it uses the word clay, and its definition is mud, mire, and damp dirt. And then if we were to read from Strong's Concordance, that's from Brown Driver Briggs, but Strong's Concordance gives you slightly different. It says, from an unused root, meaning apparently to be sticky. So it picks up this phrase of being sticky. But then it says something interesting. It says, rather, perhaps a denominative from another Hebrew number, through the idea of dirt to be swept away. Mud or clay, or figuratively, calamity. So I'm going to say that this word here is figuratively talking about a calamity. And what we're going to see is that in Daniel chapter 2, where it picks up the word miry clay, and that word miry, you're going to see it's going to trace its roots back to this number here, this H2916. And in its figurative sense, it means a calamity is coming upon this clay, because that's what that word means. It said it comes from a denominative form of 2894. So if we read 2894, 2894 means to sweep away. The dirt brush man. So I'll read that bit again. It says 2916, from an unused root, meaning apparently to be sticky, or rather perhaps a denominative from 2894 through the idea of dirt ready to be swept away. So I've got dirt that's ready to be swept away, or figuratively a calamity. So that's what this word clay means here, this 2916. Just pick up one other word, because it's going to come up in a moment. Miry. This word miry is 3121, and it comes from another word which was 3196. So there's another word, miry, that we're going to discuss in these verses that come up. And this means here, it just means mire, but it also means the dregs, which means the scrapings of something, the very dregs of something. And it comes through this root word here, which is 3196, which means fermentation or intoxication. So the reason why I'm mentioning all of this is that when you do these studies and you just do a surface study of clay, sometimes you might think you're coming to a sound, reasonable answer, but I think you can find if you dig a bit deeper that you see there's much more spiritual truth that we might realize at first sight. So let's go to Psalms chapter 40, verse 2. Psalms chapter 40, verse 2. In Psalms chapter 40, verse 2, we're going to pick up this phrase, miry and clay. It's going to pick up these two phrases, this phrase, miry, clay, which is 31:21 and 29:16. Psalms 40, verse 2. He brought me up also out of a horrible pit, out of the miry clay, and set my feet upon a rock, and established my goings. So you could understand this literally, that he's in this pit which is soft muddy clay and he's sinking in the ground, and he wants to be set onto a firm rock. But if you understand this figuratively, you know this person in his walk with God is in a condition that he's dying. He's in a calamitous situation, and he needs to be taken out of this calamity to be set on a firm, solid foundation. So that's what this verse here is teaching when it uses this term miry clay. Let's look another one. There are another couple of other verses, but that's the main one I want to pick up here. And we'll skip over that one. And let's go to the verses in the book of Daniel. So these are the ones that are going to be in the book of Daniel. So we've looked at all these definitions of clay which are found in the Bible, and now we're going to look at the ones that are found in the book of Daniel chapter 2. Before we do that, if we just read together verse 42, and there's the Daniel 2:42, and as the toes of the feet were part of iron and part of clay, so the kingdom shall be partly strong and partly broken. Now I don't know in your Bible if you have a marginal reference reading on that word. Most people do in verse 42. I have in mine, and most of the time if you've got a marginal reading in it, it will say that it's brittle. Do you have a marginal reading in your Bible? Does it say brittle?
Yes, fragile.
Fragile, yeah. So it's most Bibles say brittle. So it says that you've got, as the toes of the feet were part of iron and part of clay. So you've got iron and clay. It says, so the kingdom shall be strong, and I'm going to put brittle. or we could put fragile. So it's telling you right there what kind of clay this is. It's brittle clay. And brittle clay must be dry, fired clay. It can't be wet, sticky clay, otherwise it wouldn't, in the very definition, be brittle or fragile. But I think the proper definition, if you look in Strong's or in another concordance, it will tell you that it actually means brittle. It's something that can snap easily. So in that very verse, in verse 42, again it tells you the condition of this clay is a brittle clay. So let's look at some of the words that deal with this clay. So the clay that we're going to find in Daniel chapter 2 is from the Hebrew word 26:35. And in Brown Driver Briggs, it tells you that it can either mean clay or a potsherd. And that's the very definition that you find in the Septuagint. It's the very definition of a potsherd. So it's a fired piece of pottery. So this is from the lexicon Brown Driver Briggs, and if you go to Strong's concordance, I don't know if people use Brown Driver Briggs, but it's a good concordance. If you look at Strong's, it's called a clod. And what is a clod? A clod is a piece of mud that sticks to your shoe. You know, it's a piece of a lumpy piece of clay. Now, often when you get into a discussion with people about these things, they'll...
Or a dried piece of clay. It can be a dried
piece it could be. People...
The reason that is because the Bible says that the crops go bad under the clod. Because there's no...
So, I'm not trying to pick and choose which lexicon I want to use. I'm just telling you what it says. But it says that this word comes from another Hebrew word, which is 26:36. And if we read 26:36, it means to peel or to flake. That's in Brown Driver Briggs, but in Strong's, it says a shred or scale. So whether you go to Brown Driver Briggs or to Strong's, you're going to come to the same answer when you go down to the root words, that it's talking about a type of clay that is flaky, that's peeling, that's scaling, that's a potsherd. So from the very definition and all the usage in the book of Daniel chapter 2, when it mentions the clay, whether it's potter's or miry, all of it is talking about fragments of clay that are these shards. It tells you in the very definition of the word. In Brown Driver Briggs, it's at that very level. It calls it a potsherd. But if you go one stage down, it tells you both in Brown Driver Briggs and in Strong's that it's this type of clay that's being brought to view. And this type of clay, hopefully we're going to see, equals a church. So it is a church. Clay is defined as being God's church. It's a church that's in rebellion or apostasy. Because it's in this condition, in small pieces. So let's look at the word miry. So here we have the word miry. This is taken from Daniel chapter 2, and it's 29:17. And it says this, 29:17 miry, it says it's the Aramaic of 29:16. So 29:16 is the Hebrew, and 29:17 is the Aramaic. They're the same words. And we just looked at 29:16. 29:16 brings you right here, 29:16, and it can mean damp dirt, something that's sticky, but figuratively it's talking about a calamity or dirt that's ready to be swept away. So when it introduces the idea of miry, this is introducing the concept that this clay here, because that's the definition of the clay, it says miry clay, that this is a calamity or something that is ready to be swept away. And the thing that's ready to be swept away, or that's going to receive a calamity, are these shards or fragments of clay. So when it uses miry clay in Daniel chapter 2, it's talking about a church that's ready to be judged. It's ready to meet its calamity. And what is the judgment that it's going to receive? It's going to receive the stone coming down and destroying this statue. So in the very definition of these words and the structure in all of the things that we've looked at so far, we see that there's a calamitous thing happening to this clay. So we could look at the word potter, but the reason I didn't look at the word potter is because all it's going to teach you is that there's someone who's going to be making something. So when it says potter's clay, it's just saying that there was someone who made a vessel and it's turned into this. So that's all that potter's clay is going to lead you to. It's going to lead you to someone who made something and now the clay's in this form, and then you've got miry clay. So what I want to show here is that you've got potter's clay and then miry clay, and I agree there is a progression, but it's not a progression in the sense that it's getting from bad to worse. It's a progression of this, that potter's clay looks like these small fragments of broken pottery, and then miry clay is representing judgment upon this clay. So you see a clay in this condition and now it's going to be judged. That's the symbology that's being brought to view in Daniel chapter 2 of the potter's clay and the miry clay. So there are all the passages that deal with clay, and let's look at some verses that address this issue. So let's go to Psalms chapter 2 verse 9. Psalms chapter 2 verse 9. As we're turning there, what we're going to be looking at now is some verses that prove that when we see the term potter's clay, that we're talking about clay in this condition here. The term potter's clay, we're going to look at 3 or 4 verses that are going to show us that it's in this condition, the condition that I'm referring to. So chapter 2 verse 9, it reads, "Thou shalt break them," his people, this clay, "with a rod of iron or judgment. Thou shalt dash them in pieces like a potter's vessel." So it's picking up this phrase, potter's vessel, and I'm saying clay here is this potsherd or a vessel. So I'm going to say clay and vessel are synonymous terms. And so Psalm chapter 2 verse 9 shows you that this clay is in the condition of these fragmented pieces of pottery. Let's turn to Isaiah chapter 30. Isaiah chapter 30 is going to give us the same imagery. Verse 14. Oh, well, no, actually we'll pick up a little bit before that. We're going to pick up from verse 9. That this is a rebellious people. We're in 30 verse 9. Isaiah 30 verse 9. That this is a rebellious people, lying children, children that will not hear the law of the Lord. So you know the condition of God's people here, which say to the seers or the prophets, see not, and to the prophets, prophesy not unto us right things, speak unto us smooth things, prophesy deceits. Get you out of the way, turn aside out of the path, cause the Holy One of Israel to cease from before us. Verse 12. Wherefore thus saith the Holy One of Israel, because ye despise this word, and trust in oppression and perverseness, and stay thereon, therefore this iniquity shall be to you as a breach ready to fall, swelling out in a high wall, whose breaking cometh suddenly at an instant. So the imagery that's being brought to view in verse 13 is that there's a wall here, like a retaining wall. And we know what a representation of a wall is, yeah? A wall represents a law that's supposed to be of protection. And in verse 13, it says, the iniquity that you're doing is like a breach in a wall that's ready to swell out and whose breaking is going to come as an instant. So this wall is starting to collapse under this pressure, and it starts to bulge out. And this bulging is going to get worse and worse until you get to the stage where it's going to just break full suddenly and unexpectedly. So that's the imagery that's being brought to view in verse 13. So there's a parable within a parable, because he's going to explain what this imagery of this wall that's collapsing before their eyes is. It says, verse 14, and he shall break it, this wall, as the breaking of the potter's vessel that is broken in pieces. He shall not spare, so that there shall not be found in the bursting of it, the bursting of this wall, because of this law that's being broken, a shard to take fire from the hearth, or to take water withal out of the pit. So when this wall breaks and fragments into all these small pieces, it's going to be like small pieces of pottery clay. And these pieces are going to be so small and fine that, you know, sometimes you could use something as a kind of a tool or something. That he said these pieces are so fine they're almost like dust, that they're not going to be fit for anything. And so these portions, I've drawn them quite big here, but they're actually these small pieces of dust. And this is the condition of this clay. And then you get to the miry clay, which we read was dirt, which was ready to be swept away. You've got potsherds, these small pieces of fragment, which are now ready to be swept away because you've got a calamity. It shows you the condition of this clay, and there's judgments about to happen upon it. Let's go to Jeremiah chapter 19. Jeremiah chapter 19, reading from verse 1. And I'm just checking something before I read this. Yeah, I was just checking in my notes the history of this event. This is Jeremiah chapter 19. Jeremiah chapter 19 is connected to Jeremiah chapter 18. Remember we read Jeremiah 18 previously. It talks about this potter who's going to make something and then it doesn't work, so he's going to reform it into anything that he wants to. These verses are in the time of the reign of Jehoiakim. This is the time period of Jehoiakim that this is being dealt with. And Jehoiakim is 9/11 in our history. So in this time period here, you can see that this story is dealing with the end of the world. Chapter 19, verse 1. Thus saith the Lord God, go and get a potter's earthen bottle, or a vessel, and take of the ancients of the people and of the ancients of the priests, and go forth unto the valley of the son of Hinnom, which is by the entry of the east gate, and proclaim there the words that I shall tell thee. So, in the reign of Jehoiakim, from 9/11, he's going to take this vessel and he's going to show God's people a parable and say, hear the word of the Lord, O kings of Judah and inhabitants of Jerusalem. Thus saith the Lord of hosts, the God of Israel, behold, I will bring evil unto this place, the which whosoever heareth, his ears shall tingle. Because they have forsaken me, and have estranged this place, and have burned incense in it unto other gods, whom neither they nor their fathers have known, nor the kings of Judah, and have filled this place with the blood of innocents. And the blood of innocents is in the valley of Hinnom, and this is by the Kidron Valley, and this is where they used to kill their children and burn them alive. There's lots of evil that goes on there. Let's drop down to verse 11. Verse 10. Then shalt thou break the bottle in the sight of the men that go with thee, and shall say unto them, Thus saith the Lord of hosts, even so will I break this people in this city, as one breaketh the potter's vessel, that cannot be made whole again, and they shall bury them in Tophet, till there be no place to bury. This place Tophet is connected to the valley of Hinnom, where they sacrificed their children. Just as a side distraction, this Tophet is actually a place of drums. What they used to do is, when they were burning the children, they used to play these drums to drown out the sound of the screams and the cries of their children. And this is just right in the valley that's just below Jerusalem. And this is where he says you're going to be killed. You're going to be destroyed in the same place that you've killed your children. But it's the context of this is there's this nation that are in rebellion, open apostasy, and he says, I'm going to destroy you like I destroy a potter's vessel. And he actually destroys this vessel in their sight, showing them what their fate is. So in this story here, it's talking literally about God's people, not talking about the papal church. But what I'm trying to show is that when it talks about this term potter's clay, it's actually talking about a vessel. Everywhere you see clay in the Bible, it's talking about clay that's not in this on a potter's wheel. It's clay that's been formed into a vessel. We haven't taken the time to go into the New Testament and see how Paul uses this whole imagery that we're vessels of clay and that we're supposed to have, the living God within us, and all the imagery that's associated with that. This potter's clay is a potter's vessel, and this potter's vessel is in the condition of these small shards or fragment which are ready to receive judgment. So, however way you look at Daniel chapter 2, whether or not you line it up with all the other visions in the book of Daniel, whether you just see the imagery in Daniel chapter 2, you see how this iron and clay are mixing together, or you do a word study on what the clay is, and you run it through the Bible. There aren't that many places where you even see the word clay. I think it's about, how many places I've got? It's found in 30 verses. If you just type in the word clay, it doesn't occur that many times, and you run it through all the way through, you'll see that you always come to this same conclusion, that what's being shown here is a potter's vessel that's already been smashed, and it got smashed because it's no longer fit for use, and it's dirty earthenware that's ready to be swept away. So that's what this miry clay is trying to show. It's trying to show judgment of this clay that's in this apostate condition. The reason why we want to understand this really clearly is that as we begin to proceed in a re-evaluation of Daniel chapter 2, as we begin to see how these empires come back into our day and age and how we're supposed to interpret this passage, if we get things wrong right at the foundational stage, it causes problems along the way. We're in the process at the moment of writing a paper on this issue on a number of perspectives. There's a paper that's going to be written about the study that we've just done, about how the kingdoms of Bible prophecy repeat Ezekiel 21, because this is becoming an increasingly important issue amongst us in this movement. And one of the reasons why I wanted to bring it up here today is so that you have an opportunity to see what the issues are, and to have an opportunity to explore in your own minds, if you've not thought about it, how you understand what this clay represents. So I don't know if we want to close this prayer and then ask questions, or we just do some questions and then close.
However you want
Okay,
to do it.
go ahead. We could ask. Yeah.
Because we got like 5 minutes or 7 minutes.
I should stop. I mean, we should have her, and I should stop because I can't. What they're asking you isn't going to be on here unless you want to repeat what they ask you.
I don't mind if sometimes the questions are profitable to people. I'm open, depending on how you. Yeah.
I'm with the questions, but if you can repeat, support of response.
Okay. Oh, is that what you meant?
That's what he meant.
Okay,
You
sorry.
repeat
Yeah.
the questions.
I don't have a question per se. I'm just going to make a statement, but it's going to lead to that. everything that you said about the shards, the potter, the pot, the clay, on point. Everything's on point. The fundamental error in what you're talking about, the mistake in my mind, is that in Daniel 2, God was trying to show us a word picture. And he says that in the feet, there will be the strength of the iron. That iron comes through the feet. Remodeled, of course, but it comes through the feet. Showing us the separation of the differences between the clay and the strength of the iron. God was not trying to lose Rome in the imagery of iron, in the imagery of the clay. Clay is not Rome. Rome and the papacy is the iron, because it maintains the same strength, different than pagan Rome in the legs, but yet and still the same strength remains in the toes. The fact or what the clay is, soft, hard, is irrelevant. Shards, pieces, irrelevant. Because it's a snapshot of, excuse me everybody, but it's just showing it's not losing Rome's significance or that imagery. That's where I'm breaking down on what you're sharing.
So I guess I'm not going to repeat that because it wasn't a question. So let me ask you a question. What do you understand the clay to be representing in that statue? Just simply.
God was just showing giving us a word picture of the world at that dispensation of time.
Okay, so wherever the that is, I'm not asking what the that is. I'm just.
The feet.
Yeah, but you say that dispensation. So a dispensation you're going to put into it.
The end of time.
Okay, so you're saying that clay equals the world.
I'm saying that the iron and the clay combined, that foot, the feet that shows the iron and the clay, that was representing the world at the end of time. That's what I'm saying.
So you've got iron plus clay equals the world.
At the end of time.
Okay, I'm not arguing.
No, you're not.
Okay, so what does the iron represent?
Iron represents pagan Rome.
So iron represents pagan Rome.
Because God focused on the strength. In Daniel 2, it says the strength of the iron would be in that.
And what is the clay representing?
The rest of the world outside of Rome.
Give me one example, because you're very clear on what this is.
As an institution, it represents everything except that institution.
So name one institution that's existing besides pagan Rome.
Just people in general, the world in general. I mean, you can look at Protestant Christianity if you want to, just the secular world if you like. It's all of that combined.
So are you going to run pagan Rome right through to the very end of that?
Pagan Rome runs straight through those all the way to the toenail.
Okay, so pagan runs to the end, and what date would you put there?
I wouldn't put any date because we don't have an end date as to when Christ is coming.
Okay, but you're running pagan Rome right through to the end of the world. So pagan Rome is in existence today.
Mm-hmm.
So when you
Papacy is in existence today.
No, you said pagan.
The papacy.
Oh, that's not pagan Rome.
The papacy. Excuse me.
Sorry.
Yeah, sorry about that.
So you're making the.
Pagan Rome was in the legs.
So you're making the papacy.
Run to the toenail.
Okay, and you're saying the papacy, and you're saying this is everyone else. So if I put the world here.
Yeah. And pagan Rome is part of the world, by the way.
Pagan Rome is part of the world. So when you're going to go back to the legs. So the legs. Have you just handed in churchcraft?
Yeah.
Statecraft. Okay, I figured that's what you'd done. Do you have a problem with that statement?
I didn't even read it.
Are you familiar with it?
Addressing it, yeah.
I'll read the statement in public. If I can find it, I can't find any of my notes. It's yeah.
That's consistent.
So I'm going to be reading from 4 Bible Commentary, 1168, 4 BC, 1168. I'm just going to cut into the passage. It says, the mingling of churchcraft and statecraft is represented by the iron and the clay. This union is weakening all the power of the churches. This investing the church with the power of the state will bring evil results. So
That's exactly what I'm telling you. If the iron is pagan Rome, if the iron is the
papacy.
and the rest of the clay is representing the world, that's not in conflict.
Okay, so
Churchcraft and whatever, just whatever that's saying.
yeah, so you're saying this is church
There's no argument there.
and this is state.
Or the rest of the world. I mean, you've got,
Yeah.
you've got all of that combined.
So when you go one step back into the legs,
Yes,
and that's iron,
yes.
that iron is what?
Was pagan Rome.
So you're making iron both pagan Rome and papal Rome.
It was just a remodeled something, but it came all the way down. That strength of the iron, I mean, God is saying that in Daniel 2, that the strength of the iron is coming down through into those toes.
Okay, I understand the logic that you're bringing. Let's go into Daniel chapter 7.
All right?
Let's go into Daniel chapter 7. And in Daniel chapter 7, in Daniel chapter 2, I've got legs. So here's my legs. And what's the equivalent of the legs in Daniel chapter 7?
That was the Roman Empire.
This is pagan Rome.
Yeah.
So this is pagan. And what's the equivalent symbology in Daniel 7? It's the beast that's made of iron. It's the iron beast, which has got iron teeth, iron claws. So I'm just going to draw the head of this beast. So I'm saying this is equal here. Okay? And then in Daniel chapter 2, I'm just going to give the imagery of 10 toes. And what's the, I'm not talking about the material, I'm just talking about the symbology of the number 10. And what's the equivalent symbology of that in this? It's the 10 horns. You agree with that?
Sure. The earth is going to be broken up into 10 regions. 10
Okay,
regions
so
at the end of time.
these 10 horns are attached to this person or its head. So all of this, prophetically and historically, are pagan Rome.
But it didn't remain with 10 horns, because a little horn came up and 3 were plucked out. So it didn't stay like that.
I understand that, but it's still, this is still pagan Rome.
It has arisen, no question.
Okay, so pagan Rome is here. And when the 10 have arisen, it's only after that that the papacy is going to come on the scene. Okay, so here we have the papacy here. So what I'm suggesting is that these legs of iron represent this iron beast. But the imagery here is of the papacy.
The imagery of what?
The little horn.
Okay.
The little horn is the papacy. Now, is the papacy strong or weak in the vision of Daniel 7? I'm going to suggest it's weak,
It's conquering though in that
but it doesn't have any ability to conquer.
but it's showing the activity of conquering, whether it had it innate or
But-
it was borrowing.
But it does more than just give you the imagery that it's conquering. It defines how it's going to be conquered. Because when it does the conquering, it says before whom 3 horns are plucked up by the root, and that term before whom, and we're going to read another passage from chapter 7, if I can find it. The reason why I couldn't find that passage about Daniel 8, Daniel 7 is because I was looking in Daniel 2 for it. I should be looking in Daniel 7 for it. And I was looking at the wrong chapter. So, verse 24. So verse 8 tells you that it says, before whom there were 3 of the horns plucked up by the roots. Verse 24 says, and the 10 horns out of this kingdom, this is Daniel 7:24, are 10 kings that shall arise, and another shall arise after them, and he shall be diverse from the first, and he shall subdue 3 kings. So the first thing we want to see is that he's going to be different. So there's something about this horn that's different to all the other horns. So what's the difference? I'm suggesting that the primary difference is that these are nation states and this is a church.
But it said in one reference it talked about it being more stout.
It does.
Stronger
The reason it's stronger because it has military might to do a work for it.
Okay.
But its primary difference when it says it's different to all the rest is that these are nation states and this is a church. So that's the fundamental difference between these 2 horns. That these are countries and this is not, the papacy is not a country. Papacy is a church by definition.
There was another symbol like that given in the Bible where the Lord talked about miracles that would be done in the presence of. That's in front of or before. It's talking to before in front of it. Those horns were taken out in its presence, in front of it. But also the same thing about miracles that would be working in front of the image would be doing miracles by the strength of the beast in front of it. I mean, that's muddying things up, but nevertheless, that horn was stronger than its fellows.
What makes this horn strong? It's these 7 horns that do work for it. Isn't it?
In history, what were those 7 horns working for that stout one that came up and took 3 out?
Amen.
Yes?
Okay.
Is Clovis part of the Byzantine Empire?
No.
Okay, I was wondering.
So when you talk about the plucking up of these 3 horns,
I know she's not strong enough to do it on her own. Rome has always used other people. The barbarians, they've used
so
crusades, all that.
the plucking up of these 3 horns, you've got a choice. Either these 7 horns do it for it, or the beast does it for it. And historically, you know that it's this power that does it. It's this power that's going to pluck up these 3 horns for the papacy. These 7 horns do another work for it. So this church here, this horn, I'm going to say, from when you put history and prophecy together, is weak in and of itself. And the only thing that makes it strong is the support that it receives from this power here. Because this power here, this iron beast, because he's iron, he's the one that's going to kill or destroy these 3 horns. So it's iron that's working against these horns. Because the iron has strength to subdue these 3 horns, but the papacy doesn't. When you take this imagery and bring it back into Daniel chapter 2, when you come to the feet...
Okay, before you go there, and not to cut you off, but help me with the understanding that God shares about it being more stout. Or what does stout mean?
So
why is he used that word?
Let's read the passage, if I can find it.
Says his look was more stout, doesn't it?
Yeah, I'm just seeing...
Oh, 7:20.
20. And of the 10 horns, I read verse 20, of the 10 horns which were in his head, and of the other which came up, and before whom 3 fell, even of that horn that had eyes and a mouth that spake very great things, whose look was more stout than his fellows. And I beheld, and the same horn made war with the saints, and prevailed against them. So his look is more stout. What does he do? He overcomes this iron beast, he overcomes these 7 horns, and he has these 3 horns destroyed. So for sure he's stout, because he has the ability to bring down these legs, So he's bringing down this empire and creating his own empire. So he must, by definition, be stout. But his stoutness is all intrinsically developed or created from this iron beast and these 7 horns, which give it its support base.
Can I just say something? Looking up the stout
Yeah.
is great, and you can look in Daniel chapter 8 as you see these kingdoms, they get greater and greater.
Well, no, you gotta
So
read the whole
that
thing.
speaks to
It
greatness.
says his look was more stout than his fellows. The word fellows is implying his associates, those that he's associated with.
But I see, as you look in, you know, the waxing exceeding great, you know what I'm saying? That's how I'm seeing it. It's Gadol getting more
Well,
and more
because
Gadol.
I mean, he's the one who's claiming to be God. That's what I'm seeing here.
Is that for a word association you're doing that, or just...
Well, I'm looking at the word stout, and
Okay.
it's great.
Oh, okay.
That took me
Okay,
to
yes.
the point of
So I don't know if we
exceeding
understand
great.
what Sister Kathy's saying. When you go to Daniel chapter 8 and you see the ram, the goat, and then the little horn, you see that they all exhibit greatness. We call it self-exaltation or gadol. And as you go through that progression, you see it gets progressively worse. So when she's reading the word stout, its definition means to be great. And the greatest power out of all of them, when you go from Medo-Persia to Greece to pagan Rome to Papal Rome, it becomes the most exalted, the most selfish and self-exalted nation out of all of them, which I think is probably the definition of what it's speaking about as being stout. But it is able to subdue the pagan Roman Empire. It destroys it and annihilates that. But it does that through the assistance of whom? Pagan Rome. Pagan Rome is the actual driving or the engine that allows this papacy to come onto the scene of Earth's history.
There's just something I want to pursue in the future. That word fellows in there, it literally means associates, feminine associates. It's almost as though it's saying his look is more stout than the other churches, is what it seems like. It's saying that you can
So
pursue that.
it is stout because it's going to take things over, but it's inherently weak, and it has to use this iron beast to do its work for it. When we bring in the story of the trumpets, the first 4 trumpets in particular, it's this beast here that's going to defend it to its death. It dies in, you know, if we wanted to take 1453.
See, nevertheless,
Okay.
whether it's, and what you're saying is true, because Rome has always done that. She's always used other people to get her work done. But as we keep moving forward in history, she becomes at this period of time, becomes the strongest something that's on the earth outside of the rock that destroys her, and outside of God's people, in her development.
And how does she develop that strength and maintain it?
Because again, she uses state for her force, and she combines the benefit of all the Protestant churches, because the Bible says the whole world is going to wonder after her. So they're all going in, all the kings will give her strength for a period of time. So there will be a congealing of all the forces and resources that are available outside of Christ for her.
I understand your reasoning, but I'm just trying to bring us back to this point that the thing that makes her strong is the state power.
Sure.
But if the thing that makes her strong is state power, then when you come into the feet, you're changing this strength from a state into a church.
Iron doesn't represent the church. I mean, if it's a church, it's Roman. It's the papacy.
The papacy is the church
Sure.
by definition.
Sure.
So if you're going to make...
It's just a remodeling of the iron through the legs. But it's the same strength. It's the same doing.
The problem that you're going to face is that when you have pure iron in the legs and you come to the feet, it's going to run iron all the way through. Here's this iron that's running right the way through to the feet. In this story here, where you go from the iron beast to the time period of the papacy, you're running this iron beast through this history. This iron beast is going to be the driving engine to make this papacy rule the earth, because it does all the work for it. So when you come here, you're going to change you're going to change this iron from the iron that this is here, which is pagan Rome, and now you've switched it to a church from a state. I don't know if you can see that's what you're doing.
No, can I ask you a question, Spencer, please? We just read the Spirit of Prophecy quote where Ellen White says that the iron and the clay represent the mingling of churchcraft and statecraft.
Mhm.
Do you believe?
That's okay, I'm not.
No. Okay. So, which one is which? And if you don't agree with the clay being,
They're both the
church-
same, brother. Because in the world at this time,
why would
there's
she use
statecraft
Why would she
and
use
churchcraft.
two different
Okay.
things?
why can't church be iron? Answer that one.
Why can't church be iron? Because
Yes.
every time you run the term clay throughout the scripture,
Clay iron.
when you run the term clay throughout scripture, it's a representation of a church. Period. When you run the term iron throughout scripture, it represents someone who has enough strength to bring judgment or to destroy people. And the papacy or church has never had that ability. You need to have somebody who has greater strength than anything else. And that's what that iron represents. Iron represents a power or a force that's able to crush and destroy everything before it. And the papacy's never had that, because what the papacy needs is a state to do that work for it. What you end up doing is mixing symbols and not proof texting correctly to develop your argument.
Right, but whether she has the association of even when you look at pagan Rome, she used the association of other powers to get work done as well.
They were all states. They were all states. They weren't churches. It never went to a church and said, "Church, can you bring your priest and help me kill these people?" It used this state. And state is a representation of a metal in this vision for sure. So it's always using the state power to do that when it asks for any assistance, when it went into an alliance. But when it comes to the papacy, it's different. I think Sister Kathy had a question. She wanted to make a comment.
My comment is, I think this discussion probably is better on a one-on-one situation. I mean, instead of this, because I don't think the majority here don't have that issue, and so I think it probably would be best to close out, and then we can have some fellowship in the other hall, and there's some